Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to your meeting tonight. I know that Old Baldy is one of the oldest and best Civil War roundtables in the country, and I'm honored to be asked to present my topic to you. After the Civil War, Lieutenant Colonel William Fox of the 107th New York spent years poring through the casualty records of each of the over 2,000 infantry, cavalry, and artillery regiments that fought for the Union, spending days to weeks on the records of each of the regiments. The result was a book titled Regimental Losses in the American Civil War, which is a detailed statistical study of the number and percentage of men killed or mortally wounded in battle within each of the regiments. His analysis revealed that the Union regiment that suffered the highest percentage of battlefield deaths during the war was the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment. He created a list of the highest percentage, saying that those regiments can fairly claim the honor of having encountered the hardest fighting in the war. And the top 11 regiments are listed here. The 1st Wisconsin had almost 20% of its men who were ever entered on its roster, whether they were combatants or not, killed in combat. By the time you get to numbers 10 and 11, you'll see that the percentage has dropped significantly down to only 16%. And you also see that besides the 1st Wisconsin, 2 other regiments, the 7th Wisconsin and the 19th Indiana, were members of the Iron Brigade. The 2nd Wisconsin was formed by men who volunteered to fight for the Union immediately after the news of attack on Fort Sumter. It faced heavy fire and casualties at 1st Bull Run, 2nd Bull Run, South Mountain, Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness. And in the first 5, it contributed to tactical battlefield successes, often facing forces superior in number and storied in reputation, such as the Stonewall Brigade or the Texas Brigade. Yet only at Gettysburg can an argument be made that the 2nd Wisconsin's bravery and loss directly contributed to a strategic outcome. I contend that the Battle of Gettysburg might have been lost in the very opening moments of the infantry combat on July the 1st, but for a little known and little appreciated charge made by the 2nd Wisconsin that, in my opinion, deserves recognition equal to that given to the better known charges of the 1st Minnesota or the 20th Maine on July the 2nd. Charges made on a day that is celebrated for being a Union victory instead of a Union disaster, and made by units that had capable men able to celebrate the valor of those 2 regiments. This talk will examine the events in the woods on McPherson Ridge around 10:30 in the morning on July 1st in detail, but we'll first examine 3 events that provide important background information about the 2nd Wisconsin that helps us understand why and how the 2nd was able to succeed at Gettysburg, but at a frightful cost. So the first act takes place in Madison, Wisconsin, in May and June of 1861. Quick refresher, of course, everyone remembers that Fort Sumter was fired on April the 12th, 1861, surrendered on April the 14th, and on April the 15th, Abraham Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to put down the rebellion. Wisconsin was asked to provide just 1 regiment and is instructed that it is to form in Milwaukee. The day after Lincoln's proclamation, the governor of Wisconsin issues a similar proclamation calling for volunteers to form infantry in their local communities. The companies are to have 78 men, including 3 officers that are to be elected by the volunteers. Within 6 days of Randall's proclamation, over 20 companies formed. The first 10 are assigned to the official Wisconsin regiment forming in Milwaukee. It's interesting to ask why men enlisted at this time. There are a couple of letters from soldiers of the 2nd Wisconsin written after they reached Washington, D.C., explaining their thinking. Charles E. Brown, who was a private of Company D from Janesville, just south of Madison, in a letter to his mother on July 14th, just as the Army was about to advance on Manassas Junction, said, "I thought it was my duty to enlist and fight for this, our glorious nation. And if it is my lot to be shot, remember that I must one day die, and to die on the battlefield for our country's freedom is no shame, to be sure." He was killed in action 7 days later between 3 and 4 at 1st Bull Run. Another private, Ellis Taylor, of Company I, wrote his parents that it is sad to change our smiles and loves for bullets and for hates. Yet, parents, I will gladly die for these United States. I may not hear thy loving voice or see thy face again, yet, parents, right and law are worth whole centuries of pain. He was wounded in the wilderness and died a month and a half later, only 5 days before his company mustered out. Wisconsin's militia was a joke, well, which was true for many of the northern states at the time. It consisted of a single adjutant general, stationary for his use, and a few hundred rusty guns used for holidays. In other words, it had no bureaucratic structure or material with which to create regiments designed to fight in the field. The day after 20 regiments signed in, and in defiance of Washington, which vigorously did not want more than one regiment from Wisconsin, Governor Randall created the 2nd Wisconsin Regiment to be formed of the next 10 companies. They are told to wait in their county camps until called to Madison, which happens the following week. They are called to town. The last of the new companies arrives on May the 6th. However, the lack of infrastructure immediately becomes apparent. To say that Wisconsin was unprepared to raise militia regiments would be gross understatement. The state had no camps or other gathering places. Nonetheless, Randall was determined to call the 2nd Regiment into being as quickly as possible. It had literally, though, nothing with which to equip the volunteers. And after much hesitation by the federal government, he was told that the state would be responsible for providing everything the regiment would need other than weapons, which the U.S. could not provide at the moment, would provide at some point in the future. The government told Wisconsin to gather the 1st Regiment at Milwaukee, where the men were boarded and fed in town at commercial establishments until facilities could be built for them at the local Milwaukee fairgrounds. This was luxurious compared to the accommodations that were being prepared for the 2nd Regiment, which were to be created at the State Agricultural Fairgrounds 2 miles south of Madison. The problem is that the agricultural fairgrounds were designed to house cattle and other farm animals during summer months, and work to convert the animal sheds into barracks and mess halls began only the weekend before the volunteers to arrive. And to make things even worse, May was a terrible month, cold, rainy, and with even snow for the month. The weather being cold and wet and the barracks leaky, the soldiers suffered severely. The state had to appeal to the ladies to furnish blankets and comfortables. The last 3 companies to arrive in Madison did not even have blankets, and so they also got to stay in Madison, but march every morning 2 miles to the camp, which is called Camp Randall, which today is the football stadium for the University of Wisconsin. This is what I view as the seminal event in the creation of the 2nd Wisconsin. On Thursday, May 16th, the men were called together right after breakfast and told Washington had changed its mind and that any new regiments being formed had to enlist for 3 years instead of the 90 days that the 1st regiments. Men who are unwilling to enlist for 3 years would be given a free transportation back home. They were given a couple of hours to decide before the oath was to be administered at 10 a.m. This gave the men, who now had had at least 10 days of misery in camp and under military law, a free pass literally to get out of the military and go back home without shame. About 1/3 of the men who had shown up at Camp Randall took that option and left. However, 2/3 remained and took the oath. These men decided that the fight to preserve the Union and, as Lincoln later expressed at the Gettysburg Address, to preserve democracy was worth whatever misery that they had to endure. This left the 2nd Wisconsin with a hard core of dedicated volunteers, which later became the hard core of the Iron Brigade. In addition, Washington decided that companies should have at least 83 men, up to a maximum of 100, which required the recruitment of another 300 to 500 men. In fact, the 2nd Wisconsin recruited to the maximum strength allowed of 1,000 enlisted men, plus officers and regimental officers, and they were inducted into federal service on June the 11th, less than 2 months after the firing on Fort Sumter. The key takeaway is that the men who volunteered immediately after Fort Sumter believed that they were fighting for democracy, which would be imperiled were the southern states allowed to succeed. They had begun their military life under awful circumstances, but when given the chance to go home without shame, they instead recommitted to the fight. They would form the core of the regiment that would form the core of the Iron Brigade. The second act took place a month and a half later at the Battle of First Bull Run. The 2nd Wisconsin had been in Sherman's brigade for less than 3 weeks before the battle. This is William Tecumseh Sherman, his first command in his life of any sizable body of men. He had never before commanded a brigade or any other significant military organization. He had not had time to train his men in maneuver and fighting as a brigade, to march long distances with a field pack, or any other basics of soldiering. The men of the 2nd had not been fully armed until they reached Washington, D.C., and apparently, and incredibly, had never fired their weapons until they climbed Henry Hill at First Bull Run and fired their weapons. One veteran recalled, upon firing his weapon for the first time, that he immediately was thrown onto his back and was convinced that he had been shot by the enemy before realizing that it was simply the kickback of his weapon, which was a smoothbore Harper's Ferry musket carrying a buck and ball shot. The 2nd Wisconsin also had uniforms that were falling apart. The men talked about how you could see the flag of truce or surrender through the seat of their pants, giving the unit the nickname the Ragged Ass Second, which was a nickname they never lost. Also, at 2nd Bull Run, were wearing gray uniforms, because that was the color of the uniforms that Wisconsin had provided. And worst of all, they had a complete absence of effective military leadership above company officer level. The results of this inexperience, inefficiency, and incompetence were obvious. They were led to Henry House Hill toward the ends of the day, where Union artillery had been captured by the Confederates, primarily members of the Stonewall Brigade and the Hampton Legion. Sherman did not fight his men as a brigade. He sent first one of his regiments up the hill, and then he chose the 2nd Wisconsin to charge up the hill and try to retake the artillery. They got up the hill, and on the way, since they were wearing gray uniforms, they were shot at by other Federal units. At the top of the hill, they took on 2 Confederate regiments, one of them from the Stonewall Brigade, and they were not fighting as even a regiment. A ravine had split the regiment into 2, and there were no regimental officers to be seen. Before the battle, in a coup, the colonel had been asked to resign, and he had been assigned to Sherman's staff. The lieutenant colonel was thought to be a West Point graduate. In fact, he had washed out after only 2 years at the recommendation of the commandant, Robert E. Lee, with the approval of the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. And he disappeared immediately at the beginning of the battle, and after the battle was over, was said to be the first man seen in Washington, D.C. after riding his horse to the battle. And the major also was of no consequence. So in essence, in their first battle, the 2nd Regiment fought as 10 separate companies. They incurred a casualty rate of about 20%. And amazingly, the men themselves immediately after the battle did not feel discouraged or demoralized. They recognized that they had fought well, that they had good company officers, and that the main problem was the failure of leadership all the way up the line. A series of letters home reflect this belief. The Janesville Daily Gazette, which reviewed numerous letters coming back home after the Battle of First Bull Run, stated that the men were not cast down in spirits on account of the battle, but were hopeful, confident, and anxious to meet the enemy once more, where they promised to wipe out the memory of their late defeat. The regiment was even mentioned in one of the Eastern national newspapers, which was a rare occurrence. But the Washington National Republican stated that the 2nd Wisconsin was one of the last to leave the field. The men are reported to be doing well and more eager for a fray than before, and will go into the battle again with more coolness, but not with more courage. So the lingering question was this merely bravado, or were they truly undemoralized and eager to meet the rebels again with better officers? So the key point of Act 2 is that the men had gone into battle under the worst possible circumstances, under poor leadership from the regimental officers all the way up to Abraham Lincoln, and one might even say a Horace Greeley. They had little training, no leadership on the battlefield. They had uniforms that made them look like rebels, and twice they were shot into again by the 69th New York and took significant casualties. But they believed that they had what it took and could go toe-to-toe with the rebels with better officers in command. They had experienced severe combat and knew what it was like. After First Bull Run, it was 13 more months before they had a chance to prove whether or not they really meant to get into battle again. This was because they were assigned to King's Division in McDowell's Corps, and McDowell's Corps was withheld from McClellan in his Peninsular Campaign, and they basically spent most of the summer of 1862 either sitting in place at Fredericksburg or making ineffectual attempts to capture Stonewall Jackson. During this time, they had been brigaded with 3 other regiments under the command of John Gibbons, who was a tough artillery regular army officer who proved to be one of the better officers and generals in the Army of the Potomac. They were brigaded with the 6th Wisconsin, 7th Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana. And those regiments had to spend nearly a year listening to the men of the 2nd Wisconsin talk about what combat was like and how good they were. On the evening of August 28th, now under the command of General Pope, who was trying desperately to find Stonewall Jackson somewhere in North Virginia, the King's Division, with the Black Hat Brigade, as it was then called, was marching east on the Warrenton Pike toward the end of the day. Unbeknownst to them, Stonewall Jackson, who had half of Lee's army, was lying hidden behind Bronner's farm and along an unfinished railroad cut close to the old battlefield of First Bull Run. And when Stonewall Jackson, who was ready to reveal himself, saw an entire Union division marching across his front, having no idea he was there, he thought he would have an easy pickings to destroy yet another Union unit. So he sent his artillery first out to begin to shell the division. Unfortunately, right at that moment, even before the shelling began, its division general had an epileptic fit and was out of action. And McDowell, the Corps general, had ridden off ahead and got lost in the woods and didn't appear again for another 12 hours. Here is a very busy Civil War Trust map of the battle that resulted. The only part I want to highlight for this talk is in these yellow boxes. Because after the artillery began shelling King's division, Gibbon, seeing a battery near Bronner's farmhouse, which is over here, decided to send his one experienced regiment, the 2nd Wisconsin, up the hill to capture the artillery. The 2nd Wisconsin went up the hill with 2 companies as skirmishers and 8 in line of battle. Confederate artillery, which was actually Jackson's, decamped, but in their place, 5 rebel regiments of the Stonewall Brigade came marching out of the woods and over the hill. Now we were going to get an answer to the question of whether or not the 2nd Wisconsin really was interested in meeting the enemy again. And the answer, as written in 1863 by a member of the unit, was yes. Now was the moment when firmness and coolness were necessary. The remaining companies in line firmly awaited the charge of the rebels, the men grasping their pieces with a tighter grasp, expressing their impatience in low mutterings, in such honest, if not classic phrases as, "Come on, God damn you." And then one well-directed volley, and the rebels go to the right about. They didn't go far because for the next 2 to 3 hours, the 2nd Wisconsin has a musketry fight with the Stonewall Brigade at a distance of only 80 yards. After about 20 minutes, Gibbon was able to get the 19th Indiana in on the left flank of the 2nd Wisconsin and the 7th Wisconsin in on the right flank. But during those 20 minutes, the 2nd Wisconsin stood by itself, fighting toe-to-toe at 80 yards with the Stonewall Brigade. And in fact, given that example, the other 3 regiments in Gibbon's brigade took the line and stood firm themselves. And as more troops came in on the rebel side, and as Abner Doubleday sent in 2 regiments of his to help Gibbon's brigade, the battle continued until it was too dark to fire. Stonewall Jackson gave a report calling this battle sanguinary and admitting much to his frustration, that the Union troops did not advance, but maintained their ground with obstinate determination. John Gibbon, who served throughout the entire war, in his memoirs, called this the most terrific musketry fire he ever listened to. It was a regular stand-up fight during which neither side yielded a foot. His command exhibited in the highest degree the effects of discipline and drill, officers and men standing up to their work like old soldiers. And for a regular Army officer, you could not have given a higher compliment to volunteer soldiers. The 2nd Wisconsin went into that battle with somewhere between 450 and 500 men on the battle line and took 300 casualties. Its regimental colonel, Edgar O'Connor, who had replaced the incompetent leadership of First Bull Run, was killed. The major was wounded, and you had nearly a 60% casualty rate based upon the 511 engaged. The key point is that at Gainesville, the 2nd had been sent into battle, expecting to capture an isolated horse cavalry battery. Instead, they were surprised by the 5 regiments of the Stonewall Brigade, which was the most famous and thought to be the best brigade in the rebel army. They showed that they indeed wanted another crack at the Confederates because they held their own for 15 to 20 minutes before fellow brigade members came in to their rescue. They then fought for another hour or two, and that varies from reports, at point blank range, taking and giving massive casualties all the while. It had inspired the other regiments of the Iron Brigade, who in turn gave tangible proof to the 2nd Wisconsin that it could count on their brother regiments to have their back in combat. 2 weeks later, the 2nd Wisconsin fought at South Mountain with the remainder of the brigade, where the brigade earned the nickname the Iron Brigade. 3 days after that, it, along with the 6th Wisconsin, opened the Battle of Antietam in the cornfield and fought several rebel brigades before finally being overwhelmed by the Texas Brigade. Antietam was the last heavy combat that they saw before Gettysburg, experiencing only artillery shelling at Fredericksburg and no active combat at Chancellorsville. So now we come to the main point of tonight's talk. Herbst Woods on July 1st, 1863. At this point in time, the Iron Brigade had expanded, given all of the casualties they took at 2nd Bull Run, South Mountain, and Antietam, to include the 24th Michigan. By sheer happenstance, on the morning of July 1st, their division was closest to Gettysburg, and the 2nd Brigade in marching order, the 1st Brigade of their division being Cutler's Brigade, which was so far ahead of them they were unaware that the Iron Brigade was 2nd. And by sheer happenstance, given that marching order rotated every day, on this day, the 2nd Wisconsin would be the lead regiment in the Iron Brigade's march to Gettysburg. It was supposed to be an easy day. They knew that they were after the Confederates, but the Confederates were thought to be several days' march away, not immediately in their presence. They started an easy march, but this came to an end on the Hagerstown Pike when they reached the Cadore House. There they were told to shed their packs and to immediately begin running across country to the Lutheran Seminary while loading their weapons while on the run. At the Lutheran Seminary, they were told to head west to the Herbst Woods, as seen from the Lutheran Seminary in this picture. They continue their run, and it ends up being about a 2-mile run. And during the run, they snapped their caps against regulations, but the officers conveniently ignored that. They get to Herbst Woods, where General Reynolds himself is directing the activities of this particular regiment. The crisis is so imminent. General Reynolds, you might remember, was in effect command of half the Union Army on this day, the 1st Corps, the 11th Corps, and the 3rd Corps. But here he is on the battlefield, and as the 2nd Regiment runs up, he is reported to have said, "Forward, men, forward for God's sake, and drive those fellows out of those woods." Now, whether he actually said this to the men directly or whether he was conveying orders through orderlies might be a matter of dispute. It is noticed that he was there and he was directing at this time the movement of a single regiment. given the emergency. To recap what was going on at this moment, the gray lines on the left represent two Confederate brigades. The one toward the bottom of the picture is Archer's Brigade, a brigade of experienced combat men under an experienced combat officer. The black rectangle on the top of is Davis's brigade. The thin blue line is a division of cavalry officers under the command of John Buford, who has decided the night before that he wants to hold this ground for the rest of the Army of the Potomac to occupy in order to force Lee to attack on unfavorable terrain, just as the Union had attacked on unfavorable terrain at Fredericksburg to disastrous results. In that morning, he had sent word to John Reynolds, in command of half the Union Army, that he was holding this ground and he wanted Reynolds to assemble the infantry up at Gettysburg. Reynolds had, in fact, ridden ahead, seen the emergency, seen the wisdom of Buford, and instructed his cavalry escort to tear down all the fences between Chambersburg Pike here and the Cadore House to enable the artillery and the men to get to this location as quickly as possible. He had sent the 1st Brigade, Cutler's Brigade, north of Chambersburg Pike, holding two regiments south of it and positioning the divisional artillery on the pike. But he knew Archer's Brigade was taking possession of Herbst Woods, which he felt was the key to this portion of the battlefield, being a natural redoubt that would command any Confederate approaches either north of the woods or south of the woods. The star represents General Reynolds. The red box represents the 2nd Wisconsin at the Lutheran Seminary, about to run across the field to Reynolds. Now we come to the crux of what happened this morning. Again, the 2nd Wisconsin arrives at Reynolds' position, who instructs them to get into the woods and to drive the Confederates out of the woods. The 2nd Wisconsin obeys without question. There are 280 men in the regiment. They run into the woods and they meet Archer's brigade of 1,200 men. The 2nd Wisconsin reaches the crest of the eastern ridge in the woods. They are met with a devastating volley at point blank range from Archer's brigade, and without firing a shot, 1/3 of the 280 2nd Wisconsin men are hit and fall, including the lieutenant colonel of the regiment. This is a crisis moment in the Battle of Gettysburg that I believe is not well appreciated. Before Archer's volley, the odds were essentially 1,200 men to 280 men, about 13 Confederate men for every 3 2nd Wisconsin men. After the volley, with 1/3 down, the odds now lengthen to a 6.4 to 1, or 13 Confederate men for 2 2nd Wisconsin men. You now have less than 200 men facing a brigade of 1,200 men. Immediately behind the brigade, partially in the woods, General Reynolds is struck and falls dead from his horse before he hits the ground. It was first believed that he was hit by a sharpshooter, but that's been disputed, and it is now believed, more likely than not, that he was hit by an overshot bullet from that first volley from Archer's brigade. What does the 2nd Wisconsin do at this point? Do they come out of the woods and regroup with the remaining regiments of the Iron Brigade that are trailing behind them? Do they hold their ground like they did at 2nd Bull Run and wait for the remaining regiments to come up and support them on their flanks? Not in this case. In this case, they continue to advance into the belly of the Confederate brigade. Being combat veterans, they had to have known from that volley that they were greatly outnumbered. And the units in front of them in the woods retreat back down the western slope to Willoughby Run. General Archer, who is directly behind his brigade on foot where the 2nd Wisconsin is advancing, gives word to his right flank to try to flank the 2nd Wisconsin and catch them on their left flank and in the rears, which his brigade begins to do. Unbeknownst to him and his brigade, the next three regiments of the Iron Brigade have come up behind a crest. The 7th Wisconsin does not immediately announce itself and pitch in, but waits until the 19th Indiana comes up on its left, which of course takes time, while the 2nd Wisconsin is fighting all alone. Perhaps they also wait for the 24th Michigan, or perhaps the 7th Wisconsin and the 19th Indiana go in first, and the 24th Michigan comes in, and given the terrain, happens to come up hidden from behind, flanking the right flank of Archer's brigade, which is flanking the 2nd Wisconsin. This results in a sudden collapse of Archer's brigade, and General Archer himself is captured across Willoughby Run by a member of the 2nd Wisconsin, he being the first of Lee's generals to be captured in the war. The remnants of Archer's brigade retreat back up the hill to the top of Hare Ridge and in the woods, and the battle on this part of the field is over for several hours. Very briefly, what happens in the rest of the day is, with Reynolds dead, Doubleday takes over on this part of the battlefield. And like Reynolds, Doubleday is an experienced military man, and like Reynolds, recognizes that Herbst Woods is a redoubt that should be held at all costs, and therefore orders the Iron Brigade to continue to hold Herbst Woods, even though the brigade recognizes it's a rough position, and even gets Wadsworth's permission to withdraw, but Doubleday insists that they stay in place. And in fact, it turns out to be a highly defensible position that costs another rebel brigade, Pettigrew's brigade, immense casualties and a lot of time to take later in the afternoon. But it's eventually overrun. The 2nd Wisconsin and the rest of the 1st Corps retreat back to Seminary Ridge. While the fighting has been taking place, breastworks have been thrown up and an immense amount of Union artillery has been formed. And now it's going to take an entire 2nd Division of the rebel army a lot of time and a lot of casualties to drive the 1st Corps off of Seminary Ridge and back in confusion to Cemetery Hill at the end of the day. During this time, the 2nd Wisconsin continues to take more casualties. It was the only of the 4 regiments that took significant casualties in the morning. It was so reduced that it was taken out of line, and the 7th Wisconsin put on the right flank. Out of the 302 men, 280 of which went into Herbst Woods, another 20 of which were in a brigade guard that went to Gettysburg with the 2nd Wisconsin. 233 are casualties. Killed in action is Colonel Fairchild, is wounded and captured, and before the day is over, has his left arm amputated. And many POWs are taken. Some of them are KIAs from the morning attack, whose bodies could not be retrieved before the battle resumed later in the day. Some of them are POWs who die in prison without ever returning home. That night on Culp's Hill, Lieutenant Liswin calls the roll of the color company. Only 2 men answer out of the 20 who had been present that morning. And in the entire regiment, only 34 were present. Now, during the night and the next day, a few other men who had escaped capture on the retreat filtered their way in. But for all practical purposes, the 2nd Wisconsin was destroyed and never again would be the fighting unit that it was. This raises the question, and now we get into counterfactual history. What would have happened if the 2nd had not continued charging into the rebel brigade that greatly outnumbered them? One thing we know is that north of Chambersburg Pike, Cutler's brigade had met a disaster. 3 of its 5 regiments had been overwhelmed by Davis's brigade, and the situation was retrieved only when the remaining 2 regiments of Cutler, along with the last Iron Brigade regiment, the 6th Wisconsin, were able to charge across Chambersburg Pike and capture or kill many of Davis's brigade in a unfinished railroad cut. We also know that the division of Pender was right behind the division of Harry Heath, and that for a period of time, you had 2/9 of the rebel army against 1/18 the Union army. We know that the generals on site were Lee, A.P. Hill, Harry Heath, who may not have counted for much, and Dorsey Pender versus Oliver O. Howard, who had not distinguished himself in battlefield command, Abner Doubleday, who actually did show some ability as a battlefield commander, and Wadsworth, who was a political from New York who had run for the governorship of New York, failed, and was given as a reward a generalship in the Union Army. We know that when you look at the terrain of McPherson's Ridge and Oak Hill, that it is far more defensible for troops attacking from the west than Seminary Ridge, which has very little terrain, versus, of course, the most defensible terrain, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. We do know that every flanking attack that was launched on July 1st succeeded and drove the defenders, no matter how good or how stubborn, out of their position. And we also know that at the end of the day, with the collapse of the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps, that in effect, Cemetery Hill was not taken by the South for lack of time. Lee and Ewell, Early, A.P. Hill ran out of time to organize what very likely could have been a successful attack on the Union position on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. To that point, we also know that Winfield Scott Hancock did not arrive on the battlefield as Meade's representative until late in the day, but that his presence is what gave courage to the retreating units who were forming up on Cemetery Hill. Here is a representation of the attack north of Chambersburg Pike. 3 units, the 76th New York, 56th Pennsylvania, and 147th New York, were badly handled. If Archer takes possession of Herbst Woods down here at the bottom of the screen, instead of the Iron Brigade regaining possession of those woods, the position of the 14th Brooklyn, 95th New York, and 6th Wisconsin would have been untenable, and they probably or likely would have met a fate similar to that of the 76th New York, 56th Pennsylvania, and 147th New York, in which case now you have 6 out of the 10 regiments having been badly mauled, with Davis's brigade and Archer's brigade not seriously hurt and in command of the battlefield. So alternative possible outcomes, and of course, these are only possibilities. Had the 2nd Wisconsin and the rest of the other 3 regiments of the Iron Brigade not taken possession of Herbst Woods, had the 2nd Wisconsin waited for support from their fellow regiments, or had they even backed out of the woods, very good chance that Heath, with his brigade in possession of the woods, does not give up possession of those woods. Cutler's troop probably end up being forced to fall back to the woods on Seminary Ridge. The Iron Brigade probably has to fall back to Seminary Ridge, which is not nearly as defensible in the late morning as it would be 5 hours later. Pender's fresh division with 4 brigades will arrive before the additional 2 divisions of the 1st Corps arrive, which together equal 4 brigades. In my opinion, the best case that the Union really could have hoped for had the Herbst Woods not been reoccupied by the 2nd Wisconsin with the ultimate flanking attack of the 7th Wisconsin and 19th Indiana, is that they fall back to the Seminary Ridge and that they are able to hold it until Lee's afternoon attacks begin. But now he has gained at least a couple of hours in which he could drive the troops off of Seminary Ridge, which allows him more time to organize an attack on Cemetery Hill. The worst case for the Union is that Heath continues his aggressive approach with a couple of easy victories, brings up his other 2 brigades, and flanks the 1st Division, the Iron Brigade and Cutler's Brigade, out of their ridge line and back to Cemetery Hill, even before the remainder of the Union reinforcements arrive, even before the rest of Lee's army arrives in the early to mid-afternoon. So questions to ponder. If the 1st and 11th Corps are routed and Cemetery Hill is occupied by Lee's army by the end of the day on July 1, what does Meade do? Or what does Hancock recommend? Would Meade be compelled to assemble his army at Gettysburg and attack Lee, who's the one who holds the superior terrain? If so, it would seem that a favorable outcome is unlikely. Or does he recall his separated Army Corps to Pipe Creek, with 2 of his corps being absolutely mauled and in no fighting condition, and let Lee have an uncontested major victory on Northern soil? If he chooses that, Northern sentiment would seem to react very badly. Does he allow Lee to live unmolested in the North for the summer months, which was Lee's original plan? Does Lee get to proceed with his plan to capture Harrisburg, a major northern state capital? Does even this allow Vicksburg to be saved by giving Pemberton hope that major portions of Grant's army will have to be redeployed to deal with Lee? More questions: if Heath is successful in pushing the Armed Brigade back to Seminary Ridge after having routed at least 3 of the regiments of Cutler's brigade, does he continue to aggressively push the Federals and flank them off of Seminary Ridge? Or is he content to occupy McPherson Ridge and Herbst Woods with the Federals remaining on Cemetery Ridge? And when Pender, Rhodes, and Early arrive, now nearly half of Lee's army against a fraction of the Union Army, how does Lee plan the attack? What does Howard do? Does he even attempt to defend Seminary Ridge? And does he continue to send his 11th Corps into the Gettysburg Plain into undefensible territory? Or does he instead decide from the beginning to occupy Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill, and perhaps even have a well-prepared defensive position? If the 1st Corps and 11th Corps are routed earlier in the day before Hancock's arrives, would they really rally on Cemetery Hill under Oliver Howard's leadership? And what does Hancock decide if Lee is in the middle of attacking Cemetery Hill when Hancock arrives? At the end of the day, given what we know, given William Fox's analysis that the 2nd Wisconsin took the most casualties of any of the units that fought for the Union in the war, he concluded that the loss in the 2nd Wisconsin indicates the extreme limit of danger to which human life is exposed in a war, similar in duration and activity to the American Civil War. So if there's comments, disagreements, discussion, I'd welcome that. I will mention very briefly that the picture on the left here is my wife's great-great-grandfather's black hat, which is the only one known to survive that had been in combat and is presently in the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. He was the flag bearer carrying the flag into Herbst Woods. As he got close to Willoughby Run, within about 50 yards of Archer, he had been shot several times, but he finally took a ball to his leg that incapacitated him. Here you can see a bullet hole that went through his tall black hat. He also had been shot in each of his arms and his flagstaff, which is also preserved at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. He fell. The entire color guard had been shot before him, and he handed the flag off to a man from Company H, who earlier in the day had vowed to drop out of line the first chance he could with any sense of honor. And the picture on the right is a picture of Philo Wright at a reunion holding the flag that he carried into battle with his very same black hat on the stump. Well, thank you. I hope this was interesting and informative.